We good? Can we start? Oh. Talking into the microphone. Okay, microphone. All right. Yeah. Yeah, we're ready. You good? Okay, cool. Hey, I am John Dunlap. I am from Gotham Digital Science. We're going to talk about jump-oriented programming today. Who here has heard of jump-oriented programming? No? A little bit? Maybe read the paper that came out a few years ago. What about return-oriented programming? Who's familiar? Yeah, a little more? Okay. Whoever here has done a stack buffer overflow? Yeah? That's a little more. Okay. Cool. You know, I'm going to tune myself here to everyone's sort of base of knowledge, because this is assuming a couple things. And let's get started. Who am I? I am John Dunlap. I work for Gotham Digital Science. That's my Twitter handle. I'm an exploit developer, reverse engineer, security researcher, penetration tester, huge assembly language guy, ARM, x86, x64, even some much weirder things. We're going to talk about Sparc a little bit today. Like, who remembers Sparc? You know, even maybe a little bit of ZOS assembly. That's an interesting place to go. I'm even, you know, for me, like, assembly instructions aren't even low level enough. You know, I like messing with the encodings and finding weird edge cases with instruction encodings. So that's me. I do play too much Counter-Strike. If anyone's down to like start a clan or something, I cannot get out of silver. All right. So what is job? What we're going to talk about today is a exploit technique called jump-oriented programming. It's similar in concept to return-oriented programming. There's a paper written about it in, I believe, 2010 that sort of described the technique. But the paper itself said that they couldn't get an exploit together, right? And as we sort of look into the future of exploit mitigations, this begins to look more and more like an attractive kind of exploit. And we're going to talk about why. You know, there is going to be a time when writing ROP chains on the stack is going to be mostly kind of impossible or undesirable. All right. So today we're going to talk about potential improvements to existing ROP compilers to support jump-oriented programming development, how we can add more architecture support for current compilers and like what they support, and what architectures do we really want JOP on, right? And we're going to apply some of like the most modern, cutting-edge-ish ROP compiler ideas to jump-oriented programming, or talk about how we would do that, or what the road is to that, because it's actually a really difficult technique to pull off, as much as we'd like to do it. So this is here as a recap. If you've never done return-oriented programming, the idea is that the modern stack is protected by digital execution prevention. You cannot execute code on the modern stack, right? So you have to use return-oriented programming to disable DEP, right? So what you have is a list of gadgets, existing code from libraries that you jump back to disable DEP, right? To pull this off, you have to control the stack, right? It's a prerequisite. Jump-oriented programming improves this because we can do jump-oriented programming with or without the stack, right? That's the main reason we want to do this, because the stack is becoming increasingly undesirable as a place to do exploits. So the idea is that instead of finding gadgets that end in a return instruction, we're going to find gadgets that end in a like unconditional jump instruction, right? You know, we're going to jump EAX or jump EBX or jump ECX, right? For this to work without the stack, we need a couple more like prerequisites. It doesn't work all on its own. You might be wondering, like, how do we control program flow if we don't have a stack? We're going to talk about that in a second. You might be asking yourself why we want to do this. And the reasoning is that, number one, stack-based exploits are sort of in the sights of exploit mitigation systems. Who here has heard of the Intel Shadow Stack? No? So in a few years, Intel is going to start building a feature into their processors where it keeps track of what the stack should be. And if the stack you put in diverges too far from what the stack is or should be, it cancels execution of the program. It kills your exploit. we got to start thinking ahead if we're going to write good exploits, how we can avoid that. The other thing is, if you're writing exploits for embedded systems, for mobile, writing a really sick 0-day for Android or iOS, you're probably writing some kernel return-oriented programming, and that gets really nasty really fast. Because as you start to alter the stack in the kernel, the chances of crashing the entire system go up exponentially. It becomes harder and harder to maintain the integrity of the stack in such a way that you can leave your exploit and have the entire system continue to function happily, right? And as we look at some of those systems, there's even more mitigations like SMAP and PAN that will protect the stack from being altered. We're dealing with stuff like stack cookies. So more and more, we don't want to use the stack. We want to find a way to avoid it. It's convenient even in situations where I had a friend who was writing an Android kernel exploit, right? He's getting control of the Android kernel, and he used the jump-oriented programming not because he couldn't mess with the stack, but because it was just easier to keep the kernel running by not altering the stack. Problem is, it's hard. So here we have a basic explanation of how a jump-oriented exploit is supposed to work. This comes from the original paper, and I kind of want to go over it quasi-slowly so that we see what we're looking at. So instead of having a stack, what we have is a register pointing into memory, any memory. It could be a buffer on the heap or wherever we can control, and we're going to use that sort of as our stack. So what we need is what we call like a dispatch gadget, something to jump to and increase, to iterate our pointer to our list of instructions, and then our list of instructions will point to our functional gadgets, if that makes sense. So we're basically saying, add 4 to EDX, jump to EDX, right? And EDX is going to be pointing to an instruction like move EEX, jump EDI, and that's going to hold the location. EDI in this case would hold the location of our dispatcher gadget. And this obviously increases the complexity of the exploit quite a bit, to the point that there's basically no automated tools that are going to help you even think this way about the exploit. And true to form, the original describers of the exploit couldn't even find an exploit that worked this way in libc. They went through libc like, forget about ASLR, forget about anything else in the way. Can we make enough gadgets this way in libc? And they couldn't. We'll get into why that is in a second, but it's something we really want to overcome, right? So I wrote here a couple of the requirements for the dispatcher gadget. Basically, we need something that's going to iterate in any kind of controllable form. Because it's in a data structure we truly control, unlike the stack, which has some requirements. The stack has to work a certain kind of way or things break. We can actually make any kind of data structure, so it doesn't have to be just like a list of instructions. It could be like a linked list of instructions or something even weirder than that. And what's really going to drive how our list of instructions looks is what kind of dispatcher gadgets we can find. So the adder one that we showed earlier, where we're adding 4 to a register constantly, is the most basic form, but you could add 4 to some other different dereference location, or multiply 2 numbers again and expect addresses that multiplied and change through memory. It really depends on what you can find. The original paper goes through all kinds of variations on this. And again, the problem is there really isn't an automated tool that exists that will help you visualize and put all this together. It becomes a lot of manual work. But the benefit is that, again, you can put your list of return instructions, or jump instructions in this case, anywhere you want, as long as it's memory that you can control. So, buffers that were potentially useless to you before are now very useful. All right. And it's just going over what I said. All right. And the functional gadgets are just that. We do something and then jump. So again, it works just like ROP. We have memory access gadgets, arithmetic gadgets, branching gadgets, system calls, whole 9 yards. Works the same way. So here are the current tools that sort of, kind of support jump-oriented programming. And as I'll explain in a second, they don't really support it enough in the kinds of ways to make the classic attack possible or easy to do. And we're going to talk about like the reasons we found that was the case. Again, this is a very desirable attack. We want an easy way to do it. Easy way to think about it. So the support that you're given in all the tools across the board is basically, we're going to search for jump instructions. That's it, right? It basically dumps all the unconditional jumps out of the binary, or theoretically all of them. Actually, what I found was that many of the tools functionally failed to do that, right? And there's some reasons for that we'll get into in a second. And the sad realization that you come to when you do this is that actually programs that are generated with modern compilers don't have that many unconditional jumps built into them. For a variety of reasons, there's just even jumps that are logically unconditional are sometimes expressed as conditional jumps, which means that the things that it's trying to dump out are going to be like limited, fewer gadgets than we actually need to pull this off. So the conclusion a lot of people came to when this attack first came out was that it just wasn't Turing complete. There was no way to get enough gadgets, even on a really big binary, to pull this off, right? Or that it would require something that was very manual and very complicated and be a big waste of time. The other thing is that many of the tools don't really vet the gadgets, and a large number of them are functionally useless. And we'll see that in a second. So the other problem with many of the existing tools is they don't support all the architectures that we want, and the ones that they do support are not supported in all the ways we want them to. End of the day, a lot of architectures very much lend themselves to this kind of attack. And we want our jump-oriented programming tool to support this correctly. So I'm going to give you a quick table of the various ROP tools that support JOP and the architectures they support. Across the board, everything supports x86, okay-ish, x64, less so, and then as we get into embedded things or PowerPC ARM, it really drops off. Some of the reason that is that all this relies on capstone support and understanding of how to use the capstone library correctly, which not everyone does, or it's pretty complicated. Sadly, probably the best tool on this list, Mona.py, only supports x86, not even 64-bit binaries, which sucks. And then there's Radari, which supports everything, but has its own issues. We'll get into in a moment. Even supports AVR, which I think is really cool. Have any of you guys written AVR code past? So I actually started my career in 3D printing originally. I was a 3D printing firmware, software kind of guy, and I wrote a lot of AVR code. And what's cool about AVR is it's a Harvard architecture. Data and instructions are separate, right? They live in separate registers. So techniques like ROP and JOP are the only way to do memory corruption attacks. So kind of want this for AVR if you want to own a 3D printer, which I do. I don't know about you guys. So the way that these essentially work in all cases is that what they've done is assembled a suite of x86 instructions and just sort of hard-coded them. And the problem with that is that you're relying on your assembler or your knowledge of the encoding standard for x86 or whatever the architecture is. You're relying on that to be complete, which it may not be. And you're sort of making some assumptions about what the exploit developer actually wants to do. I'll get into some of the corner cases I found, but in general, none of the tools implemented every possible variation on the encodings that we'd want. And they're sort of more guided toward classic ROP attacks. So when you're looking for jumps, really what these tools want to help you do is find the classic jump ESP instruction that you'd use at the beginning of a ROP chain, potentially. And they don't do anything to help you with pulling this attack off. And so we're going to give you some examples of the output for jump instructions on some of these tools on medium to large size binaries. And what you'll see is that even on relatively large stuff like browsers, it finds practically nothing. So here's some smaller binaries on Ropper. Have any of you guys used Ropper before? It's a little bit. It's a Ropgadget finding tool. It dumps out all the instruction, return, or in this case, instruction, jump. In this case, we're looking for jump ESP. It finds practically nothing. Ask for jump EBX, finds practically nothing. On a much larger binary, we start to find stuff, but it's really not ideal for the attack. And the other problem with it is that if you're developing this as an exploit developer, what's giving you is a list of addresses, which is cool, but what you'd rather have is the stuff leading up to the address and actually some vetting of it, which is super important in this kind of attack. So what would be really great is if it tried to put together the final chain attack for you. And this is a feature that has existed for ROP and mini tools for a while. Like if you use Mona.py or Ropper does this, you can tell it, we're on Windows and we want to disable dep, and it will try and put together the pieces for you. And it more or less kind of works. There's nothing like that for JOP right now. And we'll get into some of the limitations why no one's tried that. And some of my basic proof of concept tools. Spoiler alert, we don't have anything quite working yet, but we're getting there. So let's look at another tool. This is Ropgadget. It does a lot better, and it gives us some of the information that we want. Again, we're asking for jump instructions, and this is sort of what it looks like. And you can tell what it's looking for is anything that ends in a jump, anything that ends in a call. Again, there's no vetting whatsoever, and it's up to the exploit developer to figure out how all this stuff fits together in memory, right? And if you've ever done any exploit development, what you'll know is that the usage of all this stuff is really dependent on what comes before it and what the state of registers and what the state of memory is. So this is kind of like a menu for something that's way more complicated than what you want to think about. It becomes like a massively time-consuming thing. Even if you have control, it can be really hard. Here's Ropgadget running against a bigger binary. And here's a third tool we're looking at. This is Mona.py. It's written by a guy named calls himself Corelan coder. He's one of the foremost experts on Windows heap exploitation. This is probably the best ROP tool out there right now, for Windows at least. He's very good at putting together pre-set up ROP chains that will turn off digital execution prevention on Windows. So this is kind of the functionality that we want. It just doesn't support jump-oriented programming the way we want it to. It has some features regarding jumps. As we see here, this is the jump feature, but it doesn't work super well. Doesn't get us even halfway to what we want to be. So we need to start thinking of ways to try and improve the process so that we don't spend the rest of our lives putting together various jump gadgets. And of course, Mona.py doesn't support anything but x86 whatsoever. And in fact, I think I had a quote on here from the guy who wrote it. It said, yeah, it would probably take some months to add x64 support properly. So it's not going to really work for what we want. Even modifying it's not going to get us the jump chains we want, which is sad. So general issues we noticed so far is lack of gadgets, right? There's not enough jump gadgets to do the exploit that we want to do. There's a major analysis overhead, right? There's a lot of stuff to look at manually and figure out how it affects the state of the processor. It's a big pain, it's a big time drain, deters us from writing cool exploits. It offers no help in finding that needed dispatch gadget and then implying what the data structure it's iterating through looks like, which would be really great to know. So ultimately, this is hugely time consuming, major pain. That's why people don't do it. That's why you don't see jump-oriented exploits in the wild. But it's really useful, so we want it. So some basic things I've done to improve these tools is to add better opcode support. So it turns out in our jump-oriented attacks, there's a bunch of jump instructions that the tools, as they're implemented, don't include. So ensuring that they find all the jump gadgets helps the attack be tractable to be possible. And the other idea here is to start looking at conditional jumps. Now, if we can find a way to include every conditional jump in the binary, then we have a lot more jumps, right? And since we already have some control of the processor, we can start to control the flags register and start to put ourselves in a situation where we can do conditional jumps instead of unconditional jumps. That opens this whole other world of exploitation up. We just need a way to programmatically think about what that will be. Or sort of manage the side effects of doing these conditional jumps. All right. So what we did with Ropper was to start including jumps to pointer. Right. It turned out it's not something it looks for. So you can jump to EEX, but it doesn't look for jump to pointer of EEX. In Intel notation, what that looks is like we have jump RAX. Instead, we want jump RAX in brackets. All right, the dereference jump. That's something we want. And we also want the dereference call instruction. That's just something they didn't add, probably because it wasn't useful in classic ROP attacks. So we added that. Ropgadget was a little more complete, but we did add some like corner case kind of encodings. All right. And Mona.py, again, what we wanted to do was add x64 support, and that just wasn't possible. It turns out at the end that the engine was far too complicated and far too dependent on being just an x86 program to modify, which is sad, because unlike all these tools, it sort of automatically just works. You know, it would be a great tool to have in your pocket just for, even for doing ROP chains, vanilla ROP chains in x86 64. So that's a project for the future. I would be glad to help Corelan and add that, but it's a massive project. He really assumed that x64 exploitation wouldn't be a thing. All right. Oh, and obviously, Mona.py only works with Immunity Debugger and the Windows kernel debugger, WinDebug. So that's a massive limitation. If you're using some other kind of debugger or don't want to be in a debugger environment, if we're just doing stack analysis, then it's not really where we want to be. And stack analysis is actually a much better place to be for this kind of exploit. All right, and what we want to work towards is comprehending what these gadgets are doing, what kind of side effects they're adding to our exploit. We want to figure out how to chain them together, and to do that, we need to classify them. Go into how that's done, or how we want to do it here. So the way that classic rope compilers work is that they're basically disassembling the instruction and grepping for keywords. You know, it disassembles an instruction, it looks for pop or return or some other add. Like if it's trying to find an adder gadget, it literally disassembles it and then sort of greps for add in the disassembly, which could be improved upon, because if you have something that adds twice, it has a different semantics than something that adds once, or something that adds an XORs. That's more than adding, right? Slightly more advanced, some of them just search for opcodes and classify that way. But again, it's not really understanding the full state of what's going on. And then we have the most hopeful technique is sort of running everything in a light VM, which is what we did in our tool. Basically take something like not like a full virtual machine, but something that just virtualizes the registers and the flag register, maybe the stack, and figures out what the side effects of the gadget are. And that's a lot better. And then once we have stuff running in a VM, we can start thinking about those conditional jumps and figuring out which of these conditional jumps can we manipulate to be unconditional and use in our exploit. And that's going to open up the possibilities for doing this kind of exploit a great deal. But it requires us to emulate what's going on, to run things in a VM in a very specific way where we learn what we want to learn and prove what we want to prove about how the exploit works. So even if we can find like a small fraction of conditional jumps that we can prove are controllable in our exploit, this is going to make this much more tractable. So I'm going to show you part of the ANYCon VM-based tool I made, and basically what it does is it reads through a list of gadgets and tells us what kind of side effects it has. And it also has a classification system where it's going to look through and figure out whether this is a good candidate for like a dispatch gadget or an adder gadget. All right, and back to that. All right, and then what we're going to do for gadget composition, putting the gadgets together, is to use a constraint solver like Z3. right? So we're going to use some mathematical libraries to say, here are the side effects of these gadgets. Let's put them in order to do a thing we want. And the problem you run into doing that, and the reason we don't have a working tool right now, is that as you try to solve on constraints for these gadgets, you get a lot of state to run through, a lot of options about how to put them together. And some techniques will have to be put together to try to limit that and try to make the problem easier for the solver to solve. Because once you start letting the solver think about buffers and memory instead of a stack, which is easier to think about, your options for the exploit just explode. So really the technique here is to start eliminating options for how this is going to be done. So one of the things we looked at was trying to adapt Corelan Coder's ROP algorithm from Mona.py into this technique. And what he uses is not a constraint solver. What he uses is backtracing. So he finds a state that he wants to get to and works backwards from that. It ends up still being pretty computationally expensive, and it's inaccurate. Since he's not virtualizing all the instructions, he's just sort of guessing about what the side effects of the instructions are going to be. Because of that, you often have to alter his exploits a little bit, but it gets you close. Ultimately, it was decided that that wouldn't work with the exploit. Here's a bit of the code that actually does the backtracing. And we talked about the SMT solver, emulator kind of idea. People have already figured out how to do this for return-oriented programming. Again, the problem is finding ways to reduce the state space. As it is, it kind of barely works for return-oriented programming. You're talking about doing a real exploit could take 30 minutes, 2 hours, 8 hours to compile and still not work. Thinking about buffers and memory outside the stack makes it a lot worse. All right, now we're going to talk about architecture. Right now, the current tools don't support architectures like ARM, AVR, Sparc super well. And while like most people are doing this kind of exploit are going to be doing on x86, these other architectures are actually highly useful with jump-oriented programming. Like these are the places where you'd want to start thinking about doing it actually. ARM is particularly well suited to it because again, in a lot of ARM situations, maybe manipulating the stack is not what you want to do. If you want to keep your program alive, there's new protections being added. And actually, it turns out Sparc works really well with this kind of exploit. Here we go. Just a word about ARM support in these tools. Again, they're very unaware of the context of the exploit that you're doing. It doesn't understand if you're in thumb mode or AVR mode for instructions. ARM mode. Jeez. All right. Nothing supports AVR, and there isn't really a programmatic scriptable VM for AVR right now. AVR disassembler frameworks kind of suck, which I think is a room, if anyone's into AVR, developing these kind of programmable simulators for it, like something like ANYCon for AVR would be a great project. All right. What we did add was Sparc support for all these tools. And again, looking into the Sparc standard and reading the Sparc encodings, it turns out this is a very effective exploit on Sparc. So what we ended up doing was just adding to the current support for tools like Ropgadget and Ropper, Sparc support. Here's a Sparc encoding example that we worked with to find unconditional jumps. And we added a bunch of variations onto this code. There's a lot of reasons that classic ROP attacks kind of work poorly in Sparc. Suffice it to say that jumping around and not messing with the stack produces fewer side effects. So what did we talk about? We talked about architecture support, included opcodes in these tools, and some ideas about how we're going to do gadget identification and gadget composition from now on. And we add some support. And we got some ideas for the future. I'm working on a tool right now. It's not finished yet, but it's going to basically adapt the current ROP technique for using solvers like Z3 and generate this jump exploit automatically. And that's what we got. So you guys have questions?
I absolutely have a question. So
Yeah.
I noticed that you're doing a lot of really awesome work, and you mentioned one of the problems that you solved was classification of side effects, and you're looking for patterns, but you didn't mention artificial intelligence at all.
So some people have applied that kind of technique. In fact, so I talked about a tool called Ropper, and there's actually another tool there's two tools right now called Ropper, because I guess someone didn't realize that there's already a Ropgadget finder called Ropper. And it's an engineer from Tenable, the people who make Nessus, and she put together a presentation. I don't know if it's out yet, but it's a genetic algorithm-based Ropgadget finder. It does work. It doesn't necessarily, I talked to her a lot before doing this kind of talk about whether it would support job. And her response was, not necessarily, but not ruling it out, because it's a machine learning based algorithm. It could come up with a job payload, right? But like my own research, she's trying to limit state. So I don't know to what degree she's modeling memory, right? And it becomes a big performance concern. Like when we're virtualizing things, we don't want to virtualize the entire memory of the program. We don't want to load the entire program. We want to avoid that as much as possible, because that's going to hurt performance a lot. We want to just kind of model the chunk of memory and the chunk of state we're worrying about right now to whatever degree we can. So I'm still waiting to see the final. Definitely look up her tool. It's cool. If you're a functional programming guy, it's written in Lisp. So definitely check it out. But she's one of the only people I know who have applied the machine learning aspect to this. There's a lot more like foundational work in using constraint solvers for these. But again, the problem becomes state and performance. Take many hours to figure this out. The other thing with using the machine learning approach is that you're not guaranteed. In any case, you're not guaranteed an optimal result. But that technique, from some of the provisional results I've seen from her tool, that technique especially does not care about getting things done in the minimal number of gadgets. It might get to the state you want, but like much later on and in a much bigger buffer than what you wanted to be dealing with. So it is an area for further research. We have other questions? No? Sure?
How strongly dependent is the value to exploit on the microarchitecture that you're dealing with? Microflow pipeline?
Oh, sure. I think that's very architecture dependent. But when you're talking about pipelines, both architectures like ARM and MIPS and Sparc 2 have features that are very pipeline dependent, and yeah, that starts to be a problem, right? So one of the things when you're doing ARM exploits, you can't have self-modifying code, right? A common thing to do in an exploit is to like have a value in a register and mutate it. Like, for instance, if you have a value that is forbidden in the exploit, like a null byte, right? You might XOR that and then change it in memory. But because of the way the pipelining works in ARM, and it's really the same problem in MIPS and Sparc to a lesser degree, you'll modify something in memory, and because it's already been pipelined, you're going to get the original value instead of the one you wanted. So that is a thing you will have to work, as we adapt this attack as well, having either making self-modifying code forbidden or working around the pipelining. Or you can trick the pipeliner, right? You can run something in a loop and start to fill up the cache. Right, exactly. So yeah, that's something to think about with these exploits. Do we have another question? No? Oh, cool.